Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining our Ask the Expert series today. And today we will be discussing plain language content creation for multiple audiences, effective communication for HCPs, patients, and caregivers. We're proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. If you have upcoming projects, are looking for some guidance regarding your plain language deliverables, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us for a free consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. Our presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And now I will welcome Lori to give an overview of our session today. Hi, Lori.
Hi, Olivia, and thanks everyone for joining today. This is as Olivia said, this is the final webinar in our series on plain language. So if you've got any interest in our previous webinars, please visit our website and check them out. Download them if you like. This one is a compilation of questions that our audience today entered when they registered, along with some questions that we didn't get to from our previous webinars, and we are going to try to get to some of those today. We've only got 45 minutes, so let's get started. We're going to try to answer questions today regarding identifying, for example, these are just some example topics, identifying your target audience and selecting the most appropriate dissemination channels for the information that you want to have them see, how to ensure key health information and clinical research findings are understandable and accessible to all, and the most common challenges and best practices that your organization can implement to support your goals. And those are just a few of the topics of the questions that looks like we're gonna be talking about today. So let's get started, Olivia.
All right, Lori. Here's our first question, and this is a question from Jennifer. She's asking, is there a possibility of making language too plain? For instance, is bringing it to a third grade level too far?
That's a question that I think I'm glad you asked it, because that's a question that's on everybody's mind, and we get questions that revolve around that theme, which is, I don't know, questions about dumbing information down, losing the intent of the original messaging or important information because you have to, kind of restructure it using plain language. So is there a possibility of making language too plain? Of course, there's a possibility of it. For example, bringing it to a third grade level too far. Well, that depends on your audience. So here we go with talking about that depends. That depends on who your audience is. And it somewhat depends on the content, but not as much. It's who is the information intended for? And is it intended for a pediatric patient or a child? Then a third grade level may not be far enough, for example, down. And what is it? And then it gets also into questions that you need to ask yourselves internally, which are, what are the goals of the communication? That's probably the most important thing to understand about your communication is, what do you want the recipient of the information to know? What is it important for them to know? Is it important for a 7-year-old to know how to dose themselves in a complicated dosing regime of a medication? Probably not. That's not a goal, because their parent or guardian or caregiver will be doing that. Is it important that you would want a 7-year-old to understand at some level why they're taking this treatment or medication or having this procedure, or what it's going to do to help them? Yes, those are probably important goals for communication. So it all depends on the goal. We also get questions, and there may be another question coming up later along this same line, which is how do you convert medical terminology into plain language? And if we've got that question coming up, I can address that then. But this is very similar to that, making language too plain, losing its meaning. So we might talk about this in another question. Good question. Thanks for asking it.
Perfect. Here's our
That's okay.
next question from Katarzyna. Can you talk about some solutions, Lori, to common pain points? For example, standardizing key messaging across multiple written deliverables and platforms.
I think I spoke about this in more detail than the previous webinars. In the last webinar, I spoke more about this than I had in some of my previous webinars on plain language. And it has to do, I kind of introduced the idea of creating almost a scaffold, if you will, of messaging across your cross-functional teams, from marketing to science to science and everybody in between. There's multiple stakeholders in the messaging that gets out there in plain language, and information that needs to be converted to plain language. It could be also instructions, the instructions for use, specific instructions on how to turn a device on or use it or turn it off, or what do you do if it malfunctions, any of those. That's very common for plain language writing. So there's a lot of stakeholders in in plain language. So your question gets to standardizing key messages across multiple written deliverables, platforms, and intentions or purposes and intended audience of the content. So are you talking to a caregiver in this case, an adult? Are you talking to a child? Are you talking to someone who might be impaired in some way? Are you talking about to a person who's actually using the device, or someone who is helping to monitor the patient? So that's one thing. Standardizing key messaging, first of all, identify your audience and the intention of the messaging. And then identify key messages or phrases that you don't want to change, or change very little in plain language, that you want to be consistent. So that scaffolding, imagine a scaffolding where everybody's feeding off of the same scaffolding. It's like you've decided on how you want to message this, and here's the language. You've decided how you want to present this information, and here's the language. So those are very common pain points, is inconsistency of the message. You explained something one way to one type of audience, and then you abandoned that explanation and that plain language and explained it to a slightly different audience using different language that you didn't need to do. That's where I know that we're all thinking that's what you worry about, is like you're cross messaging. And that's what you don't want, when information starts getting muddied because you can't control the language and to the audiences. So cross-functional meetings, someone needs to be the owner of this. Often if you have a writing team, or if this primarily comes out of marketing, to decide who the owner is. of this scaffold and the messages, agree on the key messaging language, and QC your product. QC is someone checking to make sure that whatever's written goes out there, aligns to your standard protocols and the scaffold and the rules that you've established for these messages. So those are some solutions. And I would say the solution is cross-channel communication and upfront within your team or within your organization. And then upfront decisions about what you want to say or how you want to explain something and what you don't want to say. Avoid certain words, use certain words. Here are some key plain language phrases to drop in when you're explaining something. Those are some common pain points that we use when we work with our clients.
Thanks, Lori. Here's our next question. This one's an interesting one. How does this link to training? I find that training in processes, it is also complicated and the staff won't understand. So do you have any tips or advice for this person?
Well, whoever this is, you're on the right track for sure, because training is, whether you're training staff or you're training a patient on how to use their new insulin pump. Training is training. And you have to tell them, start here, point A, point B, use it this way. You have to show them how to problem solve. You have to, training is some of the most complex ways to use plain language. And so again, let's assume for a moment that you have a training guide or manual and it's not written in plain language. So in other words, first of all, create what is it you want to tell them in normal language, in the language that you would use internally. What do you want to tell them? And then you've got to take it a step at a time to convert that into those instructions into plain language. Now, this is a great time for me to remind us and introduce the concept of infographics. Infographics, along with the language level that you're using, the use of white space, the use of graphics, arrows to point someone after you do this, an arrow points you to something else. These are all great tips and tricks to use in training. There's more than one way to communicate information, and certainly when you're communicating a process, which often training is about, or there's always a component of a process in training. And so be thinking about infographics, be thinking also about the complexity of the language and try to use clearer terms. And other things that we've done when we're putting together, say, training manuals is also another tip, check for understanding, build in understanding checks into your training manual or process, whatever it is that you're putting together. In other words, check for understanding, have them answer some questions, go back, whatever it is you want to do, have them go back and reread the material if they don't understand it, or check with the trainer if they need more clarification. So you talk about plain language and how does it help in training processes that are complicated, but that last part of your question, which is, and the staff won't understand it, that is critical. And so bravo for you mentioning it, because we can build plain language training and try to get it to a place where it's very stepwise and very what we think is easy to follow. It doesn't matter if the audience still doesn't understand it. So when you have to build in understanding checks when training, I mean, that's obvious. I know I'm saying something that you already know. You have to loop back in training to make sure that the audience has not only understood the training materials, but now they understand the content and can, quote unquote, pass a test and demonstrate understanding, whether it's a physical demonstration of a tool or a machine, or it is a written understanding in the form of a test. So plain language very much links to training, and I'm really glad for the question.
Okay, thanks, Lori. So this next couple of set of questions you're about to see, these have come through the chat and they're all pretty similar, so I'm putting them up here together. The first one, how can we simplify medical terms to layman language? And do common medical acronyms require definition? And how can we present technical issues in a simple and straightforward way?
Yes, there's a lot there, and these are really foundational questions. Now, I will point you back to, I believe, our first webinar, which was pretty heavy with a lot of resources. That was the overview of plain language. So if you're looking for resources and references and hyperlinks, I believe that was the one where we put a lot in there. And I don't remember, I'm not going to remember the site, but there is a site out there that can, or there may be other sites, I'm aware of one and I don't remember it, where you can, and you can Google it, to try to find some acceptable or standardized or commonly used plain language conversions of myocardial infarction, heart attack, that would be one, but there might be other suggestions. So I believe there are tools out there that you can tap into that can get you started with simplifying medical terms to layman's language. Common medical words should be, or terms, myocardial infarction, should be fairly straightforward to find, but simplifying medical terms and instructions are some of the most challenging uses of plain language, because you don't want to confuse. And I'm a clinician too, and we have our own language, but that doesn't mean that other people understand it at all. And they may not even understand what a heart attack is, so you can't even use that necessarily as a term. What does that really say? It's a colloquialism. It doesn't say anything. Damage to your heart muscle, it says more than heart attack. So you have to keep those kinds of thoughts in mind too. So the second question, do common medical acronyms require definition? A tenet of plain language writing is you do not use acronyms. You avoid them at almost all cost, because MI stands for myocardial infarction. Now you haven't helped. You haven't helped the person understand, because either what MI means or what myocardial infarction means. So the avoidance of acronyms is usually standard operating procedure for plain language writing. And then how to present technical issues in a simple and straightforward way. We've already sort of talked about that. I would remind us that technical issues, processes even, might lend themselves well to like a flow chart or a diagram or an infographic of some way. That is, I would start there. Technical issues in a simpler, so first of all, what do technical issues mean? Like a safety issue to the patient, something that could go wrong with, say, the device, adverse events to look out for. So it depends on what we mean by technical issues, which sort of sounds like it's related to a medical device, which then gets into the instructions for use and what do you do if, kind of answering the question, what do you do if it doesn't work, you get a red light, something doesn't seem right. So those are kind of akin to technical issues. And again, they're very, very straightforward. Language, what do you do? It's a little bit like the, what do you do if you have a medical emergency, you call 911, right? That's a, don't think about it, just do this thing. If you think you're having a medical emergency, do this thing, call 911. So it might be how to present technical issues in a simple and straightforward way. If your device or isn't working, contact your doctor immediately, for example. That is a simple and straightforward way to give the user an action verb, an action item. Do, if this is happening, do this. That's one way of simplifying when there are issues. Just tell them what to do, who to call, sit down, call 911, whatever the recommendation would be. Thanks for those questions.
All right, thanks, Lori. This next question is from Joseph. And he's asking, what about clear definition of internal standards or internal style standard setting? And how can we communicate the value to our product development teams?
Well, let's take the first question first. What about clear definitions of internal standards or internal style standards setting? I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. If we're talking about internal standards and converting standards into plain language, I hope that's what we're talking about. This is where I'm going to say that this is where internal agreement on very specific plain language phrases to use in replacement of internal standards or the more complicated language, so is very critical. If you're trying to convert standards or internal style standard setting, I'm not sure what that means, into clearer definitions, I think that is where, again, cross-functionally or within your own team, you come up with very standard ways of saying things, or calling a device a certain thing, or giving this certain instruction always in the same way. Those are some thoughts on establishing clear definitions. How can we communicate the value of plain language writing to the product development teams? Well, I'm not sure how you do that. If we're talking about product development teams, the folks that are still in R&D, if that's what we're talking about, I'm not sure. If we're talking about more marketing product, you know, a different type of product, certainly there's lots of ways to do that. But honestly, I'm not sure about how we communicate the value at the level of product development. I imagine that might be the birthplace of beginning to identify key plain language phrases to begin to insert into your internal dictionary, if you will, like always call this thing this. It's almost like you're building a dictionary of common terms, so that whenever you need to do plain language writing, you've got this dictionary of how you've explained a simple process, or what you always call this or that. So it's almost like an internal dictionary. And so if we're wondering about communicating the value to the product development teams, when we're all working off the same dictionary and we're all talking about the same thing, and we recognize the importance of plain language as it filters through the development phases, I think that that is something. So it may not be that the product development team needs to have instructions in plain language, but somebody's going to need that eventually. So how can they communicate when they're developing complex writing that is ultimately going to need to be turned into plain language? Perhaps they can set up a quick glossary or definitions or suggestions. We're putting together some sort of a patient-facing document, and we're going to write it in a certain way, or we're going to write it in our more advanced language, but we're going to start communicating standard. So that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, here's our next question, Lori, from Amber. And she is asking about plain language uses in document translation and the clinical evaluation report. What do you have to say about that?
I'll start with the clinical evaluation report. Well, maybe not. Plain language uses in document translation. All right, let's start there, because CERs can be translated, or at least parts of them can. So let's just talk about document translation. So whatever is being translated, just to be very clear, whatever is going to be translated for the competent authorities or other regional languages around the world, the translation needs to arise out of a plain language document. You don't want to convert a complex document both into plain language and into another non-English language, for example, at the same time. In other words, if the language is to be written in English, write your documents in English, and then write your plain language in English, and then that plain language document then can go through the usual document translation processes, which are very well controlled, and is something that our company doesn't do, because there are very significant companies out there who only work with document translation. So my short answer is that whatever's being translated needs to be in its final form, and if that's in plain language, you're going to need to write it in plain language first before it's translated. The CER, of course, is different in that the CER you would not want to rewrite in plain language. I feel pretty certain that's not the intent of the question. But there is in the CER, or that goes with MDR CERs, there is a document called the SSCP, Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance, which, if that medical device has a patient interaction, it's of a certain class, the SSCP must have a plain language patient-facing section, and that certainly is where you would use plain language. So document translation should be translated from the final plain language document, and the CER usage of plain language can be found in some SSCPs.
Great, thanks, Lori. We're coming down to the end of our session here and our time here today. So if you haven't sent in your question yet, you should do so soon, and we'll keep running through them. Here's our next question. This question's from Selena. What are the best practices in determining the most appropriate method of delivering information to the target audience?
Oh, you know, Selena, the webinar, by the way, the webinar that I just did, let's see, a week or so back, it was for plain language writing, for HCPs and that audience. We actually talked about that in that webinar. And maybe you saw that webinar and you still have further questions, or you haven't. The best practices for determining the most appropriate method of delivering information to target audiences. I think there's a few pillars there to talk about. First of all, what is it that you want the target audience to know? What's your goal of the communication? For example, are you informing them? Are you giving them instructions? Are you translating warnings and precautions? So what is it that they need to know? How to get help in an emergency, who to call if they have questions, how to use their new insulin pump. So it depends on what the goal of the information is. And next, it depends on who the audience is. For example, for that insulin pump analogy, is this for you? Are you the operator of the insulin pump? Or are you a caregiver or a parent of someone who is wearing the insulin pump? So again, how do you, and what information do you write for the caregiver versus what information do you present to the 10-year-old that is wearing the insulin pump? So those are some considerations. What are the best practices in determining the most appropriate method of delivering the information? Now let's talk about that, delivery of information. What we talked about in the webinar last week were the different communication channels that are available to you. For example, TV. I mean, we can't turn on our television if any of us are still watching commercial television without seeing a commercial for something. So TV is a channel. Radio, probably not as much anymore. And now let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the internet. And how are ads placed on the internet? So what are the appropriate methods of delivering information to target audiences? You're going to look at those cross-channel communications, reach out via social media, via the internet itself, via well-placed ads, targeted ads on those mediums, and then or targeted email blasts, however you can get to these people. So the most appropriate method of delivering information to a target audience, I would imagine it depends on the demographics of the audience. Are you wanting to communicate to senior citizens or to someone who consumes all of their information from Instagram, for example? So those are some of the ways things that you would think about. Now with plain language, then what are the best practices then in determining not only the appropriate method? So let's just say you're reaching out via social media, which are, Twitter, which is has somewhat some character limits. So now is when that messaging and those key phrases and very specific plain language is really going to come into play, because those are the platforms where plain language works the best. You want to hook those people with information and then perhaps redirect them over to other channels where further information is available. So first of all, find where they live, capture their interest there, and then continue to deliver through the channels that they use best.
Okay, thanks, Lori. I think we have time for a couple more questions. This next one is from Robin, and she's asking, what should I consider for documents that are translated into multiple languages?
Well, here's a translation question that I'm hesitant to weigh in on very much, because we honestly don't see how they're translated. What I would say is it's the job of a good translation company and service to be able to meaningfully translate plain language into regional dialects, even using some colloquialisms that, of course, for example, in English written material, you wouldn't know. In other words, what does it mean in that particular regional language, and how would a good translation service take what we've written in English and make it meaningful for people in Urdu, for example. So I would say one of the things that you should consider is when you're finding a translation service is to make sure that there's maybe some collaboration set up, so that if the translation service has some questions about very specific language in a document, there's a mechanism that they can come back to the client and say, explain what you meant by this in English, because this is how we're translating it in Urdu, and it means something, maybe means something that you didn't intend. So I don't know, I don't think that you can write plain language documents in English that are meant and do multiple versions of them. I don't think you want to do that. So what should I consider for documents that are translated into multiple language? First of all, you've got to write one document. And then you've got to have a good translation company that can take the intent of that document and very carefully translate it in a language that is meaningful to the target audience.
Okay, thanks, Lori. So this next comment is from Mariana, and she said it would be good to hear advice on patient educational materials wording. So Lori, do you have any tips or recommendations for plain language in this area?
I think, and we touched on this before, so I hope that helped. I think to reiterate and expand further, patient educational materials, it's critical that patient understands that. So I could repeat again, understand your audience. Who are you talking to? What are the goals of the material? All of that, I think, goes without saying at this point. But let's think about format for a little bit now. I've touched upon that a couple of times in this. Plain language writing isn't just about words at all. It is also about the use of white space, font, colors, design, certain infographics that may or may not be appropriate or useful. There are many things that go into many different considerations that must be thought about in plain language writing, and especially, I think, in patient educational materials, because often there are processes involved in patient educational materials, and there are warnings, and so there's a really important information that needs to be put across, and it's critical that the patient can access that information and make it actionable. One more thing about patient-facing plain language materials, of which educational materials are one of them. If you're working for a company, or you're the manufacturer or the pharmaceutical or biologic company, and you're wondering about this, hopefully your company has some access to patient advocacy groups, has some relationships with some key patient advocacy groups. Consider peer review. I think that is, if you're not doing that, that could be very, very helpful to do peer review. Design some sort of a feedback form, maybe a questionnaire. Did they really understand the material? And get their feedback for patients that are part of your target patient population. So that's some advice that I have. Patient advocacy groups. Have them be your best judge. They're your best judge. Maybe one more question?
Sure, I think we have time for one more. How do you balance accuracy with plain language, and do you have any resources that you can share?
Well, we talked about, if you go back to the webinar that we did at the very beginning, number 1, that there's quite a bit of resources and links on that one. How do you balance accuracy with plain language? That is, I think we've talked about that a little bit. The people are squeamish, understandably so, because many of us are scientists, and we're used to speaking in very specific language, and it makes us nervous when we have to speak to or write material that is less direct. We're used to messaging things very directly, so that but we're messaging it to ourselves, to each other, so we all understand the language. So it's tough to convert over to plain language, and you worry about the message being lost, that you're not even understand, the person doesn't even understand what you're talking to, or you've left some key information out, or you have de-emphasized it because you had to use language that isn't very specific. I mentioned earlier in our in the question and answer that there is a tool out there, I'm sorry I don't know it, that might have some standardized plain language conversions of standardized acronyms. That look for that. And look for, another thing you could do is look for with your competitors or whoever else is talking about the same thing that you want to talk about in plain language. What are their materials out there? They're probably out on the internet. How do they use, what kind of words do they use? And that might help with standardizing your messages as well. But you're not going to get the same kind of accuracy that we get when we talk in our native scientific language. It's just not possible. But I would say accuracy is one thing, understanding is another. So you first and foremost, for your plain language audience, they need to understand what you're talking about. So accurate understanding, to me, trumps very specific accuracy, as they get the message and they understand it and they know what to do. That is, that's the key hallmarks of plain language for lay persons. Thanks everybody for your questions. I hope this was helpful. Thank you for attending. We had a great crowd today and great questions. Olivia, any final thoughts from you?
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, for all of your really great questions today. Take care, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.